What if I told you that one of the most promising bands ever signed by the Beatles was destroyed not by musical failure, but by the very industry that was supposed to protect them? What if a group celebrated as the new Fab Four, a band with global hits, superstar mentors, and millions flowing through the system, somehow ended up penniless and ultimately dead? Their managers made fortunes. Their labels made fortunes. Their songs became immortal. Yet the men who wrote them, men whose music shook the world, were left with nothing but despair. 2 suicides, collapsed careers, missing money, lawsuits, and a legacy reconstructed only after their deaths. This is the devastating story of how Badfinger, Apple Records' golden hope, rose from a small Welsh port city to international stardom, only to be torn apart by betrayal so deep it still echoes today. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Band History for more untold stories of rock's greatest triumphs and tragedies. The Dream, Swansea, Wales, early 1960. A working-class port city with gray streets, cold mornings, and the kind of tight-knit music community where every club, every pub, every backroom rehearsal meant something. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't London. It wasn't Liverpool. But it was home for 4 young musicians who believed, quietly, stubbornly, that they could break out of the shadows. Pete Ham, a shy genius with melodies pouring out of him faster than he could record them, became the emotional center of the group. Alongside him stood Di Jenkins on rhythm guitar, Ron Griffiths on bass, and Roy Anderson on drums. They called themselves the Ivies, and long before critics labeled them Beatles Protégés, their sets were built not on British pop, but on raw American R&B, Motown grooves, soul covers, and tight vocal harmonies that set them apart from other Welsh bands. But even in these early days, the band carried a vulnerability that would later become their downfall. They trusted easily. They believed people meant well. They believed the music would protect them. One night, after a performance that left the small Swansea crowd roaring, a local session musician named Bill Collins noticed something special. He wasn't a flashy manager or a big-time producer, but he had industry connections, and more importantly, he believed in them. He took them under his wing, promised them guidance, and soon moved them into his communal house at Golders Green in London. The Ivies didn't question it. They were paid £5 a week. They slept in cramped rooms, shared food, and built makeshift recording equipment from whatever they could find. And Pete Ham, always the dreamer, stayed awake late into the night, crafting songs in a tiny basement studio, dozens of them, hundreds eventually. But beneath this promising rise lay a subtle warning sign. The Ivies were talented, ambitious, and hungry, but completely unprepared for the business world that was waiting. They were artists in the purest sense, and in the music business, purity often comes with a price. Tell us in the comments, did you ever hear of the Ivies before they became Badfinger? We'd love to know how deep your music history knowledge goes. As their reputation grew, so did their opportunities. Collins pushed them hard, booking them as the backing band for pop singer David Garrick. Sometimes the crowd screamed louder for the band than for Garrick himself, especially for Di Jenkins, whose charisma pulled attention like a magnet. The imbalance became too obvious. The Ivies were fired. Still, they kept moving forward. London was a different world, bigger, louder, more competitive, but it was also where fate would finally set their future in motion. Collins reached out to an old friend, Mal Evans, roadie and aide to the Beatles. Evans attended an Ivies show at the Marquee Club, and something in their sound, Pete Ham's voice, the R&B grit, the harmonies, felt right, Evans brought their demos to Apple Records, and that was it. They became the first non-Beatles act signed to Apple Records. It felt like destiny. But destiny, as they'd learned, always has a cost. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Badfinger's origins, hit the like button to help more rock history fans discover band history. Apple released their first single, Maybe Tomorrow, in 1968. Everyone at Apple assumed the band's association with the Beatles guaranteed a hit. Even Paul McCartney reassured them confidently, this one will be big. But in America, it only reached number 67. Apple was in turmoil. Alan Klein had just arrived, restructuring the company, firing staff, and freezing projects. The Ivies' album release in the U.S. was canceled. The band was devastated. Meanwhile, internal tension grew. Di Jenkins was losing interest and was replaced by a sharp, passionate musician from Liverpool named Tom Evans. His arrival triggered immediate friction. Evans complained about everything, especially about being the only Liverpudlian in a Welsh band. But his musicianship transformed them. With Evans in and Griffiths drifting out, the Ivies were evolving into the lineup that eventually became legendary. But their battles with Apple Records weren't over. Tom Evans publicly criticized the chaos inside Apple, saying the Ivies were guinea pigs, being hurt by the company's disorganization. When Paul McCartney read that interview, he didn't get angry. He got involved. McCartney handed them a Beatles demo, Come and Get It, and told them exactly how to record it. They listened, and it changed everything. The Ascent. When Paul McCartney handed the Ivies a polished Beatles demo and told them, almost casually, to record it exactly as he had arranged it, the band treated his instructions like scripture. They walked into the studio, followed every musical cue, and delivered a version so faithful that McCartney reportedly said it was perfect on the first take. The song was Come and Get It, and when it hit the airwaves in early 1970, it exploded. For the first time, the band felt the momentum of a true international hit. It charted in the top 10 in both the US and the UK, instantly transforming the Ivies from an obscure Welsh act into the newest stars of Apple Records. But a hit single needed a stronger identity, and Apple insisted the band choose a new name. Several were suggested: Glass Onion, Home, and even the mischievous Priest. The winning choice came from Apple executive Neil Aspinall, who pulled inspiration from an old Beatles working title, Badfinger Boogie. And so the Ivies became Badfinger, a name that carried both luck and a curse in equal measure. With Tom Evans fully on board and guitarist Joey Molland newly added, the classic Badfinger lineup finally took shape. They recorded their first proper album under the new name, Magic Christian Music, tied to the Peter Sellers and Ringo Starr film, The Magic Christian. Critics debated whether Badfinger sounded too much like the Beatles, but fans didn't care. They heard something fresh, sincere, and melodic, songs filled with longing, youthful energy, and the unmistakable brilliance of Pete Ham. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit the like button. Your support helps more rock fans discover band history. Badfinger's second album, No Dice, marked the real turning point. This time, the songwriting partnership of Pete Ham and Tom Evans blossomed into something extraordinary. They wrote with a kind of chemistry critics compared to Lennon and McCartney, though both men rejected the comparison. Badfinger wasn't trying to imitate anyone. They were simply growing into themselves. No Dice delivered No Matter What, a hit single that raced up the charts and proved Badfinger could succeed entirely on their own terms. And then came the masterpiece. During a late-night writing session, Pete Ham brought a melancholic progression he'd been playing for days. Tom Evans added a soaring chorus. Together they shaped Without You, a song so powerful and universal that it eventually became one of the most famous ballads in pop history. At the time, Badfinger didn't realize what they had created. They released it quietly on No Dice without pushing it as a single. But when Harry Nilsson covered it, the song became a worldwide phenomenon. Later, Mariah Carey would bring it to another generation, turning it into one of the most enduring heartbreak anthems ever recorded. And yet, the men who wrote the song didn't receive the fortune, protection, or security such a timeless hit should have guaranteed. They were still living in cramped rooms with their wives and girlfriends, still paid tiny stipends, still confused about where the money from their growing success was going. Behind the music, the financial foundation of Badfinger's world was beginning to shake. In the middle of all this creative momentum, Apple Records was falling apart. Alan Klein had seized control and was rapidly restructuring the company. Staff were fired, projects canceled, budgets slashed. Badfinger's albums received little promotion and distribution was erratic. One day the band had a team behind them. The next day, no one at Apple seemed to know who was in charge of their releases. But the band kept working. Even with chaos swirling around them, Badfinger created Straight Up, one of the greatest power pop records of the 1970s. Produced at different stages by both Todd Rundgren and George Harrison, the album featured Baby Blue and Day After Day, two of their most unforgettable tracks. Harrison even invited the band to participate in the Bangladesh relief effort, reinforcing the idea that Badfinger were more than just protégés. They were peers among giants. Now would be a great time to subscribe to Band History so you never miss these deep dives into rock's most dramatic stories. For all the acclaim and opportunity, there was still one question the band whispered to each other late at night inside Golders Green. Where was the money? Royalty statements were vague. Payments were slow. Their lifestyle didn't match their rising fame. But when they asked Bill Collins, he reassured them. When they asked Apple, the company was too disorganized to provide answers. They were still young, still hopeful, still trusting. And into that vulnerability stepped a man who would change everything, Stan Polly. Polly was charismatic, confident, and impeccably dressed. A New York businessman with an impressive roster of clients and a talent for making musicians feel both protected and important. He promised Badfinger financial stability, major tours, proper advances, and wealth beyond anything Apple had provided. He spoke like a man who understood the industry's hidden traps and knew exactly how to conquer them. Pete Ham, ever optimistic, believed him. Joey Molland, ambitious and eager for growth, believed him. Mike Gibbons, impressed by Polly's smooth professionalism, believed him. Only Tom Evans hesitated, sensing something uneasy in Polly's two perfect offers. Still, under pressure and hopeful for a better future, all four members eventually signed. What they didn't know was that Stan Polly's contract would become the single most destructive document in Badfinger's entire history, one that would tear the band apart, bankrupt them, and push two of its songwriters toward tragedy. If you're following this journey, leave a comment below telling us your favorite Badfinger song, Baby Blue, Day After Day, or Without You. The ascent was over. The fall was about to begin. By 1971, Badfinger had become one of the brightest young bands in rock. Their songwriting was ascending, their singles were charting internationally, and Apple Records still viewed them as one of the label's most promising acts. But at the very same moment, the company that signed them, the company that once placed them beside the Beatles, was falling apart from within. As Apple Records' internal foundation began to collapse, Badfinger found themselves exposed to a developing crisis that would soon engulf their entire career. Apple Records collapses. The band is exposed. The collapse began when Alan Klein was brought in to manage Apple's finances. Apple had always been informal and artist-friendly, but it was also chaotic and unprofitable. Klein took drastic measures. He dismissed staff, restructured departments, and slashed budgets. The label's once bohemian atmosphere disappeared almost overnight. These changes affected every artist on the roster, including Badfinger. During this period, No Dice nearly became collateral damage. Internal debates over the album's commercial viability delayed its release, and the promotional department, already weakened by firings, was unable to support the record with the enthusiasm Badfinger expected. Publicists who had championed the band were no longer employed. Some promotional materials were never distributed. Radio outreach stalled. While Apple's infrastructure continued to degrade, Badfinger increasingly realized they had lost the support system that once amplified their momentum. Scheduling became difficult. Communication with executives became strained or inconsistent, and the staff who believed in the band's potential no longer had the authority to push projects forward. The Apple label that had signed them enthusiastically in 1968 simply no longer existed by 1971. The band did not witness a single cataclysmic moment. The collapse was gradual, fragmented, and confusing. But they saw enough to understand that Apple could no longer provide stability. And without stability, Badfinger became vulnerable to outside forces that would soon reshape their lives entirely. Warner Brothers' contract, the trap tightens. With Apple faltering, Badfinger's future depended on a new label. Stan Polly positioned himself as the solution. He approached Warner Brothers and negotiated a substantial multi-album contract on the band's behalf. What Badfinger did not fully understand at the time were the financial and structural implications of the contracts Polly arranged. Under Polly's guidance, the band entered a demanding agreement requiring them to deliver an album approximately every 6 months. This pace placed extraordinary creative pressure on them, especially at a moment when they were already dealing with Apple's instability. The deal also included significant advances, but the band had limited visibility into how those funds were managed. Polly established several companies, an arrangement that he claimed would protect the band's financial interests. In practice, these entities obscured the flow of money. Warner Brothers sent their advance payments to Badfinger Enterprises, a company controlled entirely by Polly. The band had little oversight over its structure or accounting. Then the critical discovery appeared. Warner Brothers could not identify the location of approximately $250,000 in advance money. The funds had been transferred into Polly's network of companies, and when Warner sought documentation, the answers they received were either incomplete or evasive. As Warner grew more concerned, the band continued working. They recorded Wish You Were Here under considerable pressure, delivering one of their strongest albums. But the financial questions surrounding the missing advance were already beginning to overshadow their creative achievements. The irony was profound. The more Badfinger worked, the more control Polly gained over the proceeds. And the more control he gained, the less the band understood their own financial situation, lawsuits, missing money, and panic. Warner Brothers escalated the situation when they determined that the missing funds posed a legal and financial liability. They filed a lawsuit not only against the corporate entities, but specifically against Badfinger because the contracts placed responsibility for the funds on the band. This was a devastating blow. Because of the lawsuit, Warner Brothers froze the band's accounts associated with the contract, This effectively cut off their income from touring, recording, and publishing. The band had no access to the money they believed they were earning. In one of the most damaging repercussions, Warner Brothers made the decision to pull the album Wish You Were Here from record stores only weeks after its release. It was not removed due to its quality. Critics later praised the record, but because of legal concerns surrounding the missing advance. Without distribution, the album stood no chance of reaching listeners. Badfinger's momentum evaporated instantly. During this period, many people attempted to contact Stan Polly for clarification, including the band. Polly reportedly became increasingly difficult to reach, offering limited responses or none at all. To the band, this deepened the sense of panic. Without Polly, they had no clear explanation for Warner's legal actions and no way to defend themselves effectively. Pete Ham, who had long believed in Polly's promises, was shaken by what was happening. His confidence in the band's financial footing was replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. The pressure of the lawsuit, the loss of income, and the inability to make Polly accountable placed enormous strain on his emotional health. Badfinger suddenly found themselves in a situation where they were being sued, their music suppressed, their income frozen, and their manager inaccessible. The collapse was now total and personal. Joey Molland quits. Internal collapse begins. Badfinger's internal structure began to fracture under the stress. Arguments became common, fueled by confusion, anger, and fear about their future. The band had spent years working endlessly, trusting their manager and believing success would eventually bring financial security. Instead, they found themselves facing legal turmoil and insolvency. Joey Molland and Pete Ham disagreed over how to handle Polly, touring decisions, and future plans. These tensions escalated into heated disagreements. Molland believed the situation demanded immediate and drastic action. Pete still hoped the band could recover if they fulfilled their obligations. As the pressure mounted, their once creative partnership eroded. Eventually, Molland made the decision to leave the band. His departure created a rupture from which Badfinger would not recover. Without him, the group lost not only a guitarist and songwriter, but also one of its essential creative perspectives. Pete Ham, already overwhelmed, became increasingly withdrawn. Friends and bandmates later described a significant shift in his demeanor. He carried guilt over the band's situation and feared for his financial ability to support his family. Tom Evans attempted to stabilize the group, but he too was emotionally exhausted. Mike Gibbons, facing his own stresses, could do little to change the developing collapse. The band was now fighting on three fronts: against Warner Brothers, against financial ruin, and against internal division. All three battles were being lost. Pete Ham's final weeks. The final weeks of Pete Ham's life were shaped by financial devastation and emotional exhaustion. Court documents, bank statements, and accounts from those close to him confirmed that Pete discovered he had no access to his money. The band's accounts were frozen by court order. Polly could not or would not provide funds. Promised payments never materialized. Pete was expecting a child with his girlfriend. The realization that he was financially unable to support his growing family compounded the despair created by years of mismanagement. He expressed concerns to those around him, revealing the extent of his anxiety. His belief that Polly had deceived him deepened by the day. On April 24, 1975, Pete Ham was found dead. He left behind a pregnant girlfriend who gave birth to their daughter 1 month after his death. His note had the statement, "I will not be allowed to love and trust everybody. This is better." It also included an accusatory blast toward Badfinger's business manager, Stan Polly. P.S. Stan Polly is a soulless bastard. I will take him with me. News of Ham's death was not widely disseminated at the time, as no public comment was made by the Beatles, Apple Corps Lelty, or Warner Brothers Records. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Pete's death did not simply mark the end of Badfinger's frontman. It marked the moment when the consequences of the band's exploitation became undeniable. The damage was irreversible. Pete Ham's death sent shockwaves through the remaining members of Badfinger, but it also sent shockwaves through an industry still embroiled in the legal and financial controversies that helped push him to the breaking point. The tragedy halted the band's activities instantly. Warner Brothers, already fighting the group in court over the missing advance from Badfinger Enterprises, dropped them from the label. Wish You Were Here remained unavailable due to the lawsuit. The band's financial accounts were still frozen, and the men who survived were left with grief, confusion, and a complete collapse of their livelihoods. Immediate fallout after Pete Ham's death. The immediate years following 1975 were defined by instability. With Warner pulling their support and Apple Records no longer functional, Badfinger had no label, no income, and no infrastructure. Instead of receiving royalty checks or financial assistance, the surviving members were met with more legal complications. The lawsuits between Warner Brothers and Badfinger Enterprises continued well after Pete's death, tying up assets and preventing the payout of royalties the band desperately needed. Tom Evans, Joey Molland, and Mike Gibbons each found themselves in precarious financial positions. They sought work wherever they could find it: session work, side projects, pub gigs, or short-term band collaborations. But nothing came close to the steady income Badfinger should have been earning from its catalog. Many of their songs were still in rotation on radio stations, still being played in clubs, and still selling in various markets. But those royalties were trapped behind the litigation walls built by Badfinger Enterprises' mismanagement. The band members were also divided geographically. Molland returned to the United States and began working on independent musical projects. Gibbons drifted between the UK and the US, taking jobs as needed. Evans remained in England, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so brutally. During this turbulent time, two different versions of Badfinger emerged. Both were formed not out of rivalry at first, but out of financial necessity. With few professional opportunities available, each member attempted to rebuild their career using the one resource they still possessed, the Badfinger name. Tom Evans joined a lineup that included Bob Jackson, who had briefly performed with Badfinger near the end of the Warner era. Meanwhile, Joey Molland assembled his own group that performed under the same name. This led to confusion among promoters, fans, and even record labels. Lawsuits and counterclaims followed, each further fracturing the legacy of a band already fractured by tragedy. Despite the personal and professional struggles, all three surviving members shared one sentiment: the belief that the music deserved a chance to be heard again. But without Ham, whose songwriting had given the band its emotional identity, the chemistry was never the same. Reviews of the competing Badfinger lineups ranged from sympathetic to critical, and the legal issues made it nearly impossible to sustain momentum. Financial turmoil persisted across all members during these years. Some relied on loans from friends. Others worked odd jobs or fell into debt. The reality was stark. Despite selling millions of records in their prime, the surviving members of Badfinger had almost nothing to show for it. From 1975 to 1980, the band lived not as legacy artists, but as men struggling to stay afloat. The long separation. By the early 1980s, the surviving members were living separate lives, each shaped by unresolved trauma and financial instability. The most affected was Tom Evans. Evans never emotionally recovered from Pete Ham's death. Friends and family confirm that he continued to speak about Pete frequently, often referring to him as a musical brother whose loss he could not fully process. The grief hardened into something deeper over time, a combination of guilt, sadness, and unresolved anger at the circumstances that had led to Pete's suicide. Meanwhile, Evans became embroiled in new disputes over royalties, especially concerning "Without You." The song, co-written by Evans and Ham, had become a global hit through Harry Nilsson's cover in 1971. It earned millions in royalties worldwide, but Evans received only a fraction of what he believed he was owed. Publishers, former bandmates, and various estates clashed over songwriting shares and contractual details. Evans believed he deserved a larger portion of the royalties, and he pursued this through legal channels, negotiations, and personal appeals. These efforts often ended in frustration. During these years, alcohol became a recurring component of Evans' life, as documented by interviews with those close to him. His emotional volatility increased, his relationships suffered, and his disputes over money became more intense. He lived with a constant sense of being wronged, first by the music industry, then by Stan Polly's financial manipulation, and finally by the complexity surrounding "Without You." By 1983, Tom Evans' emotional state was fragile. The combination of financial instability, the unresolved grief over Pete Ham, the conflicting versions of Badfinger, and the ongoing royalty battles placed immense pressure on him. There is no need for dramatization here. Multiple biographies and interviews confirm that Evans was overwhelmed, exhausted, and unable to escape the weight of the band's past. Tom Evans' death. On November 19, 1983, Tom Evans was found dead. His death came after an argument regarding the royalties of "Without You," a dispute that had persisted for years and had reignited with particular force in the months leading up to his passing. His emotional state had been deteriorating for some time, and the argument served as the final breaking point in an already unbearable situation. Evans' death mirrored Pete Ham's in both method and tragic context. Both men were financially ruined despite their musical achievements. Both were involved in ongoing legal battles. Both had been exploited by the same manager. And both carried emotional burdens they felt unable to resolve. The irony was devastating. The two men who wrote "Without You," a song celebrated worldwide for its emotional vulnerability, died believing they had been abandoned. Evans' passing closed the darkest chapter in Badfinger's story, marking the loss of two extraordinary songwriters whose legacy had been overshadowed by the tragedies that consumed them. Legacy and final ownership. In the years following Tom Evans' death, the Badfinger story slowly began to shift from tragedy to perspective. Music historians, journalists, and fans re-examined the band's work, recognizing that beneath the turmoil lay a catalog of remarkably crafted songs. "Baby Blue," "Day After Day," "No Matter What," and "Without You" became touchstones for younger musicians, many of whom cited Badfinger as pioneers of melodic rock and early power pop. Royalties issues eventually resolved to the extent possible under the complicated circumstances. Estates received compensation from reissues, licensing, and publishing arrangements. The process was slow, but over time, Badfinger's catalog achieved a level of respect and visibility it never had during the crises of the 1970s and 1980s. Joey Molland became the last surviving member of the classic lineup, and he took on the role of preserving the band's legacy. His performances, interviews, and storytelling helped paint a more complete picture of what Badfinger had endured and achieved. He spoke openly about the band's music, the tragedies, and the lessons learned, ensuring that the full history, good and bad, would not be forgotten. Then, in 2013, a cultural resurgence arrived unexpectedly. When the final episode of Breaking Bad aired, the show closed with Baby Blue playing over the last sequence. The moment introduced Badfinger to millions of new listeners across the world. Downloads and streams surged dramatically. Articles revisited the band's tragic history. Younger audiences explored their catalog for the first time. Baby Blue found new life, not as a relic of the 1970s, but as a defining television moment in modern pop culture. This resurgence led to renewed appreciation for Pete Ham and Tom Evans as elite songwriters. Critics emphasized their melodic instincts, emotional depth, and influence on later generations of musicians. The tragedy of their lives remained part of the story, but no longer overshadowed the brilliance of their music. Badfinger had finally been reclaimed, not by labels, not by managers, not by litigation, but by listeners. The legacy of Badfinger stands as one of the most powerful contrasts in rock history. Their rise was fueled by talent, sincerity, and the mentorship of music legends. Their fall was driven by betrayal, predatory contracts, and systemic failures that left two gifted songwriters without protection. They were innocent musicians navigating an industry often hostile to innocence, and the consequences were devastating. Yet their music refused to die. Songs like Day After Day, Baby Blue, and especially Without You continued to resonate long after the men who wrote them were gone. The tragedy is profound. These timeless classics earned millions for others, while Pete Ham and Tom Evans died with almost nothing. But their art endured. Today, Badfinger is remembered not for their suffering, but for the brilliance that came before it, the harmonies, the melodies, and the emotional honesty that shaped generations of musicians. Their story is a reminder that music can outlive the injustices that surround it, carrying truth long after the world has moved on. What's your memory of Badfinger? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories of rock's greatest triumphs and tragedies.